Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded. We are taking the fight to the airwaves as we stand for liberty, oppose tyranny, and give equal opportunity in exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats and the Republicans. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Joe and Joe.
Great to be back with you. I'm Joe, your economic host, giving you the contrarian take and tearing down the mainstream media narratives one bit at a time, particularly in relationships to economics.
And I am also Joe, your social host, working class Marine Corps veteran, and street-level activist for the Libertarian Party.
And tonight's episode, we're going to be covering four broad topics. The first one is to give you guys an update as to where Jo Jorgenson stands in her presidential status. So, it's no secret that among the pollsters that's been going on for presidential elections, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the only two names mentioned. We're going to give our take on how strong or how weak Joe's doing and ways that and ideas to help motivate and support her campaign, because we're both libertarians and she's about as anti-federalist as you can get. Second thing I'll be covering is Donald Trump may be plotting something in the late third quarter, a deep Hail Mary pass, so to say, to save his election. The poll numbers are staggeringly high for Joe Biden, even so that there's rumors going on inside the Republican camp that they're worried about losing to Biden, possibly even in a landslide. So I'll give you our take on that. And then lastly is I will give you my take on where we stand in the economy and what that means for our future. In the meantime, Joe's going to be tackling the infrastructure debacle, and that's pretty relevant because right now floating through Congress, Trump is trying to jam through an infrastructure bill, and we'll be going through all the problems that come from that when the government tries to manage things, and also provide our own libertarian take on what infrastructure is and how it can truly service the needs of the people. So going into Jo Jorgenson right now, in the official polls, Jo Jorgenson's not mentioned in the presidential polls, as I mentioned, just a few seconds ago. It's just Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So gathering it, there's obviously the option when someone asks the questions like, who are you voting for, Donald Trump, Joe Biden? There is the option for other, and saying I'll vote third party, but she's just not mentioned. Neither is any of the other smaller third party candidates. So what I have been doing I have been collecting data, the polls, and gauging the third-party support among those polls. And then what I have done is taken it and realized that in terms of real results, the Libertarian Party got about half of that percent in terms of poll numbers in actual results in 2016. So in other words, in 2016, Gary Johnson, who was the Libertarian presidential nominee, he received 3.3% of the popular vote as a percentage of total votes. But the third-party polling, when you combine his numbers with Jill Stein's, it was actually at 6.6. So he was actually polling at 4.7, and she was polling at 1.9, and then the polls overestimated. So they gave a total of 6.6, and he pulled in 3.3. So I'll give you my assessment on that. Right now, Jo Jorgenson is polling, in my opinion, she's probably getting about 2.5% to 3% of the vote right now. The third-party support is hovering just over 5%, and that's that's just where it stands right now. It doesn't mean that it's bad or good. It's actually not bad, all things considering, but. Joe, Paul, I'd like to hear your guys' take on that. What can we really trust those numbers, or is it really just that we're taking a shot in the dark of looking, what her support is?
You are trying to interpret the absence of her name.
Exactly.
You're trying to draw results from the absence of her name, and that's its own difficulty. I have kind of accepted that I am not in a position to know how well Joe is or is not doing. Within my sphere of influence, it seems like she's doing fantastic. A ton of the guys I was in the Marine Corps with are all posting libertarian type things. I'm seeing jokes online like the Marine Corps makes as many libertarians as it does Marines. I'm seeing more and more mention of libertarianism online and more mention of Joe Jorgenson online. But I am also a producer of that kind of thing, and I don't really know how much of this is random stuff I'm coming across that's generated, out away from me, and how much of it is just kind of feedback from my own efforts. How much am I just seeing the crop that I've sown? I've got other people talking to me like, yo, Joe Jorgensen, like, I'm hearing about her from here. It seems like, she seems to be really doing something, and that's exciting for me to hear from non-libertarians. But the only reason we're even having that conversation is because I'm the libertarian they know. I don't know how good she's doing. I'm optimistic. I feel like she's doing well, but I just don't know.
Well, check this out. So, obviously, poll numbers, when people are not mentioned, you hit it on the head, right? It's like that's not going to be a reliable study, but I have found something that is reliable, and this has to do with campaign contributions. So I ran just a simple linear regression analysis on how much the campaign, the Libertarian presidential nominee, received in campaign contributions and how much of the percentage of the popular vote that they received. So let me give you an example. In 2004, the Libertarian presidential nominee received 0.3% of the vote. Their campaign contributions were 1.1 million. That's how many people donated to them. So when I ran my regression analysis, it came out and predicted that the candidate would receive 0.4%, which is pretty close. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2008, the campaign for that presidential nominee raised $1.4 million. And they received 0.4% of the popular vote. And my regression analysis calculated that they would receive 0.4% of the popular vote, because we're rounding to the nearest tenth. 2012 comes around. Gary Johnson ends up raising $3.2 million when you count his little super PAC that he had, and he received 1% of the popular vote. And my regression analysis predicted 0.9. Then in 2016, he raised $13.4 million, and he received 3.3% of the popular vote, and using the regression analysis, it came out to 3.3. So I think that what we can do is if we can extrapolate how Joe Jorgensen's doing in raising funds, it'll gauge how much support she gets.
You'll have to be able to compare Johnson's results month to month unless you just want to be able to know, and that's a very exciting model, but it's only helpful if you can compare her progress at this point in the campaign to his progress at this point in the campaign. And naturally, there's the giant monkey wrench of COVID-19 and the massive effect that's having on campaigning, and also the effect it's having on people's financial well-being and their ability to donate. Although you don't really need to consider that from a perspective of their ability to donate, because we are on hard times. That is what it is. That is going to reduce donations, period.
Yeah.
But
no,
anyway,
I completely.
Do you have a
Go ahead.
right now?
No, and the reason why is because the campaign contributions are only updated quarterly. So all we've got is her first quarter contributions, which were nothing. They were only $32,000, and that's not surprising because that was still during the primaries. This is now the presidential candidate will be raising funds. But you're right. Without gauging where Johnson was at that time, we're not going to be able to keep track. So that model will only be great as a last-minute predictor of how she's going to do in November. So another route that I'm going.
Data.
Yeah, another route that I'm taking, though, and I think this one can be more reliable. But that being said, I've got to figure out a way to quantify it. Is to take the membership of the Facebook members on Joe Jorgensen's and Spike Cohen's for President's Facebook site, and they're growing pretty rapidly. They're growing at about 2,000 members a day, which means that if they continue going at a linear rate, so we obviously know not everything goes at the linear rate; things fluctuate up and down. They'll wind up with 400,000 members by election day. Now, I think that's actually pretty statistically significant, but I don't know how that'll translate into votes.
And thus is the libertarian frustration. When you get blocked out of legitimate polls and you get blocked out of debates and you get shut out in the mainstream media, all of your campaigning is done at the grassroots level, and you really don't know what your labor hath brought until you see that percentage at the end of at the end of election night. And for those listening that are curious, I'm going to address this now. Why are we so fixated on these minuscule percentages? The answer is that the Libertarians as a party, our strategy is not, we don't think Joe's going to win this election. Right now, you are actually funding both Biden and Trump's campaigns. Most people don't realize that, but the Republican and Democratic parties actually get federal funding. And the rules associated with that are that you do not have access to that federal funding until you get to 5%. As Libertarians, we feel a little bit sleazy about it because we are against the entire idea of federal funding of elections, but alas, we have to get the federal funding of the elections to get into the position to undo federal funding for elections. Along with that, we need to be placing 15% in nationwide polls in order to land on the debate stage. And once we're on the debate stage, we are that election or one or two elections away from our first president. We're shut out in mainstream media, and we need polling and debates and notoriety to get into that. But the reason, even though we are not going to win this election, we still really encourage people to come out and vote on that. It's kind of like a libertarian census. And we need that percentage, never mind the federal funding. We don't even really give a fuck about that. We need that percentage to be high enough to demonstrate, to get the notoriety. We want to piss people off. We want everybody to say we ruined the election, and if we had just voted for this person or that person, the election wouldn't have gone this way. We need that notoriety. We need that media coverage. And that is one of the biggest things you can do for the Libertarian Party is actually vote for us.
The other thing that this does is that, this is something that happened with Ross Perot and Ron Paul. They did not win their Ron Paul didn't even win the primaries, but I can tell you this. As someone who watched the Republican primaries in 2012, Ron Paul changed the nature of the conversation during the primaries. He actually, while talking about abolishing the Fed, he had gotten to the point where he attracted so much attention about it that he got the Republican candidates talking about things that they would take to restrict the Fed. Now, of course, nothing ever was done, partially because they never won. But we also know that Republicans are two-faced liars. As Joe Biden would say, they're dog-faced pony soldiers, whatever that means. But the point is that you can't trust them. But going back to that, Ross Perot, though, had changed the nature to forcing George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton to talk more about the national debt as well as the trade issues that were going on and a lot of other issues and problems that the two sides just didn't really seem to talk about. So it's vital that we do support our candidate. And Joe's, by the way, she's a fantastic candidate. She's very common sense oriented. Her philosophy is simply this. She thinks the government spends too much and she wants to cut its spending, and she thinks we get into too many wars, so she wants to bring our troops home. I don't really see how you can argue with that. She thinks that the government has its hand in too many things and it should be deregulated. That's it. It's very, very simple philosophy. And, it's something that probably a lot of Republicans would nod their heads on. It's just they never do. And the Democrats would probably nod their heads on about being anti-war. but it's something that they never do. So one good thing to note, though, is that third-party support has been increasing in the last month, and this has to do with Donald Trump's poll numbers drastically falling in the wake of COVID-19, particularly after George Floyd's death. I think that the Trump response of going neo-fascist, for lack of a better word, or at least threatening martial law, kind of backfired on his poll numbers. Trump predictably doubled down and such, but he's now the poll numbers have gotten his hit so hard where he's down by 8% against Joe Biden. He was never, just for a frame of reference, in case if you guys are ever wondering, it says, well, the polls were off about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump at this time too. You're right, they were. But you see, Hillary Clinton's lead over Donald Trump never, ever reached 8%. Certainly not at this point. At this point in time, the lead was actually pretty narrow. And at her strongest point, Hillary Clinton only was about maybe 6% above Donald Trump, but never in the realm of 8%. So Biden's clearly got a dominating lead right now. And, of course, we know this because Biden is hiding right now. At the minute that Biden comes out into the limelight and starts speaking, those numbers will evaporate. But this leads to my second point, is that I think that Donald Trump has got a Hail Mary pass that he's going to throw at the bottom of the fourth quarter, down by 7 to try to tie things up or to try to eke out the win with the extra point. And this is it. So the stimulus bills were passed in April, right? And during the 3 months of time, so between April, May, and now June, our U.S. government's national debt increased by $2.6 trillion. Let me be clear here. That's double the annual deficit that we were supposed to have run with the $1 trillion of spending that our federal government has been doing every year, that Donald Trump and the Republicans promised that they would restrain and cut. But once again, they have lied to you. They have taken you for fools, and they have taken that money and have spent it and squandered it on endless wars once again without any cuts anywhere else. And then when the Democrats come and demand more spending, they capitulate to them like the fools that they are. And then you have morons like Mike Pence come on and try to tell you that it's a win for America, that the government is screwing you both ways, taking your money and spending it and running up the debt. It's the case of Dumb and Dumber. Harry and Lloyd Christmas spent all the money from the briefcase, and they filled it with worthless IOUs, and they promised they're going to pay you back from the investment in their stupid, ridiculous warm store. Except this time, Harry and Lloyd have got a gun, and they can rob you and take your money to pay back the debt with. It's complete idiocy. So with all of that, you would think that with the stimulus and the COVID-19 crashes, Donald Trump would have spent all that money, but he didn't. You see, the deficit in March was only $800 billion. And then in May, it was $400 billion. And then in June, it is probably going to be around $200 to $300 billion. So that's $1.4 to $1.5 trillion spent. Well, where the heck did the other $1.1, $1.2 trillion go? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the interesting part. That $1.2 trillion is stocked away at an account that the General Treasury, that is the federal government, has, and it just so happens that they have that money stocked away at the Federal Reserve. So before 2008, your federal government used to deposit money into banks, and so the banks were able to create loans off of that money and put it in Dr. Evil air quotes, create some economic growth. Well, ever since 2008, they have parked their money at the Fed, and they had $400 billion stocked away at the Federal Reserve, sitting there in an account doing nothing until COVID-19 hit. Now they've got an extra $1.2 trillion sitting at the Fed. So they've got a whopping $1.6 trillion. Now, here's my theory. This is what I think is going to happen. In the late third quarter, Donald Trump is going to find a way, if he does not get his stimulus bills passed, Donald Trump is going to find a way to use that stimulus money in the third quarter, so sometime in August, September, October, and it will have that magical growth effect that is an illusion, but it can give Donald Trump the argument, the idea that to implant inside the American people's head that the economy is roaring back to life. He's making America great again. America is coming back. We are standing up, and so that might be able to swing support back his way, since with the Republicans, they usually make their stake on the economy. So that's my theory. What do you guys think?
I'll be interested to see. I don't have a whole lot to add to that.
Okay. No problem. I know that
anybody listening, if you've got a free hand and a free device, go to usdebtclock.org. Just pull that page out, take a glimpse of it. If you can, screen cap it the second you open it. And then at the end of the podcast, I'm going to ask you to take a look at that page again. It is the running active total of, I'm sure it's calculated, but yeah, just to drive home the point of how much we freaking spend. Watch that number run.
I think that Donald Trump has. I personally think that's an ace in the hole that he is going to use to try to, basically he could use it as kind of a public works program, an FDR way of lowering unemployment. And so that's what I think he's going to do. It's going to be quite, well, I don't know. Trump is pretty bombastic. He could either make a huge announcement to use that stimulus money, or he could try to do it quietly. But either way, I would not be surprised if it started lowering the unemployment rate, just because of whatever he decides to enhance with it will cause, at least in the initial term, jobs to come back, so to say. Now, we libertarians obviously believe that whole thing is hokey. It doesn't work. The government can't take your money and then give you back your money and then claim that they're growing anything. They didn't do anything with the wealth. They haven't invested anything. Whatever investment is just what they've pillaged from you in your pockets. They took from you, gave it back to you, and then said, now you're wealthier, which is a whole crock. So, there's really nothing that they can do about it. But going off of this, I'll go into my third point, and that is the status of our economy. Now, I've said it before that I was worried that with the government shutdowns with COVID-19, that I was worried that we were going to see a total collapse of our economic system. In my past podcast recordings that we've done, especially my early ones, I was very, very concerned that this could be it, that this could be the end as we know it. A long time ago, about maybe a couple of years ago, I had actually created an economic model. The model was based off of default rates on loans. Let me explain. I believe that our economy is driven by debt. It shouldn't be, but it is. Debt is not sustainable. Debt is only sustainable as long as you can pay it back. So as long as businesses and people pay back their debt, the economy is fine, at least on the surface. Underneath, it's not, because the debt continuously builds, because the government continuously floods the markets with more and more debt, trying to create the growth that they can never create, but that has your problems with it. Eventually, it gets to a point, though, where we've got so much debt in our economy, we cannot possibly pay it back. And then through one mechanism or another, the interest rates start to go up. Whether the Fed raises the interest rates or whether price inflation raises the interest rate, it doesn't really matter. The interest rates eventually go up. That makes your debt payments more expensive. You can't pay it back. You crash. Common examples in the mid-2000s. Mid-2000s, there were a lot of adjustable rate mortgages that were handed out by the banks. The Fed had lowered the interest rates, their Fed funds rate, to 1%. So those mortgage rates were really low. They gave you these 3-year locked-in rates, these ARMs, these adjustable rate mortgages. And then after 2 or 3 years, it would function as part of the market rates. But in 2 to 3 years, the Fed had jacked up interest rates all the way up to over 5%. Well, those mortgage rates soared. The homeowners could not pay back the loans. They crashed the market. So this goes on and on and on again in each cycle. What I have noticed, though, is based off of a formula that I have written to try to call the default rates. It's based off of the amount of loans and the interest rate in our economy. What I noticed, though, is that my model that I created was flashing red in late 2018 and early 2019. So that meant that the Fed had raised rates too much and there was too much debt for the economy to handle. So it started flashing red. That means that the crash was not going to happen yet. It flashed red last time in 2006. So, but it does mean that we should start to see default rates to start picking up, at least in the next year or so, right? Well, after 2019 happened, the Fed started lowering interest rates. So in 2019, they recognized that there were problems that were coming out in the economy, so they started lowering interest rates. They never did this before. Before, when they lowered interest rates, it was always when the markets crashed. They were always blind to the bad. But this time, Chairman Powell was a little bit more wary. So he lowered interest rates earlier, and that caused my model to go back into, I would call it yellow, cautionary status. So in my opinion, despite the COVID-19 shutdown, I don't think we're flashing red anymore. I think that the economy is actually intact as far as the credit markets are. What the Fed did do is that they bought so much debt, they purchased so much debt from so many businesses that it has essentially paralyzed all growth in the markets because they kept them alive, but they're alive with so much debt, and the only way that they're going to be able to survive is if interest rates stay zero forever. Eventually, this is going to have an effect, and this is the part that's going to destroy us, is that it will cause price inflation to occur. There will be price inflation from this. We don't know when. I would say that due to the disturbances that have been going on, it's going to be sooner rather than later. So probably in the next 6 months to a year. And when that price inflation starts to materialize, it'll build slowly at first. At first, it won't be all that bad. But when it starts to build, price inflation has another effect. It forces up interest rates. You have to think about this. Banks are not going to make a loan of money for, say, 2% when the inflation rate is 3%. That means they're losing money because prices have gone up more than what they are going to get back in a loan that they're making that they're not even sure if they're going to get that loan back because they're taking a risk on it. So banks will always price in their loans above the inflation rate. That's just nature of the beast. Very rarely will they ever take losses, and if they are, it is usually because the government has worked some kind of back deal where it's purchasing that debt. And so, in other words, the banks are making the money. They're just making the money from the government, and the government's the one that takes the losses. And since we know that the government doesn't have any wealth on its own, you, the taxpayers, are actually paying that bill. But that's a different story. Eventually, inflation rate will force up the interest rate. The Fed can fight this. They could try to fight this, and they probably will. Because the last time the interest rates went up was in the 1970s. And our total debt to GDP in the 1970s, in 1979, total debt now, this includes government debt, private debt, corporate bonds, the whole 9 yards, everything was 150% of GDP. It is now 400% of GDP. Our GDP is about $19 trillion, and our total debt is $76 trillion. If the interest rates go up on 400% of GDP, there's no way we're escaping this with one or two bad recessions in the 80s. It's going to be the Great Depression all over again. It's going to be worse than that. And so they've set us up for that total collapse. They've set us up for this entire market crisis. What they have done, though, is saved us from this initial crisis. But then, as we Austrians have said, because we always look at the bigger picture, we Austrian economists, we Libertarian economists, always look at the long term and the bigger picture. True, you may have saved us from the initial crash, but you set us up for something much worse. And so I'm letting you know that it's coming. It's not coming right now, okay? It'll come when the interest rates start to rise because the inflation rate has gotten out of control. And that's when we will start to see real problems, because then there's nothing the Fed can do. The Fed can either raise the interest rates and cause the crash, which means they have to let everything go bankrupt, and quite possibly the federal government, which would be a disaster in and of itself, or they could do what libertarian economists have predicted. A libertarian economist by the name of Ludwig von Mises, who was famous for inventing the Austrian theory of credit bubbles and credit, he predicted that the Fed would be faced with the decision to either crash the markets now and cause a credit contraction, or to try to print currency to fight it, but it would destroy the currency and cause endless inflation. And so that's where I fear that we are going to head in the next few years, is a set of hyperinflation. Now, that being said, you probably have heard this before in the last 10 years, especially if you keep up with markets, where people in the past have made their predictions and stuff, and they're like, oh, there's going to be hyperinflation from what the Fed's doing, and then everything seemed to be A-okay. I'm not telling you that it's going to happen. I'm telling you that it very well could happen, because we have essentially created the conditions that can allow that, and that's where the problems come in. If we have done that and we have created the problems to allow that, then by definition, those problems had to have materialized under the two-party Republican-Democrat system. That system created it. What did they do? They ignored all the debt and spending that they were doing. They found every excuse to increase spending, no excuse to cut spending, and every excuse to kick the football down the field, kick the can down the road, and let it be somebody else's problem. And so what I'm telling you, as we have always said, that can't go on forever. And it's not going to be for tomorrow's generation or our grandchildren's generation. It's going to be for our generation. Our generation is going to face this. We are going to face this crisis. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, it may take 2 years. But we're going to face this crisis. And unless if we do a change, unless if we take an abrupt 180-degree change and go the opposite way, reduce government spending, start slashing regulations, and allow the economy to grow, and start running surpluses, not just balancing the budget, running surpluses and taking the surpluses and paying down the debt like Post to do, only then would we be able to get back to a sustainable path of recovery. And I can tell you this now, the only presidential candidate that is campaigning on anything remotely close to that is Joe Jorgensen. Donald Trump's not going to pay down the debt. You know what Donald Trump is going to do? Donald Trump is going to campaign on more tax cuts that with no spending cuts. And you know what that's going to do? Blow up the debt. Is it going to create any economic growth? No. Why? Because whatever the government borrows, it has to spend. And so if it spends, it squanders and wastes. It just trades money off the government debit card, but it puts the money on the government credit card. Taxes hurt the economy because the government takes the money out of the economy. Well, where do you think government debt comes from? It comes from the exact same sector. It comes right out of the economy. It just changes the area that it takes it out of, but the effects and the damage are no less. It does damage the economy, and worse yet, you have to pay it back. Now let's go on to Joe Biden. Looney Tune liberal Joe Biden. We know what he's going to do. He's going to raise taxes on the rich, but instead of taking that money to pay down the debt with it, you know what he'll do? He'll just finance more spending programs. He's got Bernie Sanders and the lunatic Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez whispering in his ears on ways to make Medicare for all, which would be astronomical in terms of government spending that we cannot afford. He would be doing that to justify more public works, more infrastructure spending programs that don't do a bit of good. They do nothing but destroy and erode growth because the government doesn't know what to do with your money. And my friend Joe is going to talk about that in a few minutes. And so we know that we can't trust Biden. Both sides are going to get you into war. Do you think either one is going to pull the troops out of Afghanistan? My God, we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. Do you really think anyone's going to pull us out? Meanwhile, the troops are dying over there. Do you really think any person's going to stabilize the Middle East? Donald Trump promised to pull us out of Syria. That hasn't worked. We're still arming Syria, and we're still bombing Assad. The only reason why you haven't heard about it lately is because of COVID-19. You think Joe Biden's going to be any different? He's got the same neocons talking in his ears telling us that Russia is the great threat that we all have to worry about, despite the fact that the Russians have killed exactly 0 Americans in the last 40 years. But never mind that. Russia is the big threat. And the same Cold War politicians that have been in office for 60 years are whispering to both of their ears into both of their ears. And if you think that Donald Trump is anything different, think about who Trump has nominated to his cabinet positions. They are rank and file, normal, everyday neocon Republicans. War crazy, spending crazy. None of them have any type of fiscal restraint in their minds. None of them have any principles. They are all there to just sit there and play geopolitical chess with Russia. So by default, if those two are doing the exact same thing, then I've got a novel idea. Don't vote for him. Vote for Jo Jorgensen. She could use your vote. And by the way, you would be voting for policies that actually make sense. And they would actually restore some liberty and some integrity to our country again. So this November, make sure that you go gold. Vote gold, vote libertarian, and vote hard. The more that we get, the bigger the message that we can send to Washington, D.C. And speaking of Washington, D.C. and big things, Donald Trump is trying to float into the Republican ears a jammed-through packed bill of $1.2 trillion in so-called infrastructure. Joe, why don't you tell us about government funding with infrastructure and how much of a disaster that is?
Sure will. First off, I want to comment on something you said about no Russians having killed anyone so-and-so in this. A couple of fairly reliable news sources today, their source on this was an anonymous person close to, with information, yada, yada, yada. Allegedly, Russia was putting out bounties on American troops in Afghanistan. We will see if that turns into anything or just disappears. Again, the media outlets, Task and Purpose is a very popular military media outlet. They reported on it. But again, the source for the information is remaining anonymous, so I don't know. I just thought that was interesting, and I'm going ahead and throwing that out before anybody decides to call in and correct you on it if that proves to be true. Second, we need to do this every session, and we always forget. Getting in contact with us, folks. We're on Facebook, Anti-Federalist Radio. We broadcast on Blog Talk Live, of course, Blog Talk Radio. We are also on Spotify, YouTube. Joe can go over the list of the others. Also, Joe, what's our email?
Our email is antifederalistradio@gmail.com. And guys, if you want to call in, the number to reach us is 516-418-5584. I've also started posting that in our links on Facebook. So if you like and follow us on Facebook, you'll be able to remain in contact. And if you want to be a part of the show, you dial that number and we will put you in the host queue and hopefully look forward to hearing your opinions on our take.
Yep. So there's that. And if you're in the Guilford County area, reach out to us. All three of us are active members of the the Libertarian Party of Guilford County. And we do a lot of good stuff. We run a food drive through a food bank through that organization. We are currently in talks with the Red Cross to host a blood drive. So if you've been looking to donate blood, reach out to us. That's all going on. Anyway, we really need to throw all that information out every episode, and we always forget. Reach out to us. We're a growing organization. It's exciting stuff. Anyway, on to infrastructure. I don't know anything about Donald Trump's infrastructure bill. Not going to go into that. Can y'all hear me right now? I'm getting a call from somebody else, and I want to make sure it didn't cut me off.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So, infrastructure. It is a running joke with libertarians that when you start talking about libertarianism, the first question you get is, well, who's going to build the roads? I have never personally been asked this question or had this conversation, but it is deemed the ultimate trump card to arguing with a libertarian. And it's funny because it's a very, very weak argument. We're going to go into why here. So the go-to answer is, well, who builds them now? The government. No, they don't. The government doesn't build anything. The government hires a private civilian contractor to build the road for you. Oh, but the government is the one hiring them, and the government's the one paying them. Well, no. You're the taxpayer. You're the one paying them. You're paying for the road. So you are paying a civilian contractor to build the road with the government as a middleman, with the notion that only government is capable of managing this whole project and doing it effectively. So we're gonna go and break all that down and explain why that's really not how it's working out. First, in your local area, are you satisfied with the roads? Do you feel that your money is being spent wisely? The answer is most likely no. Second, on the subject of who will build the roads, the whole reason we always have this conversation is that people feel that nobody will pay their fair share for that kind of a product. If it's a public good that people can just use, then why would anybody pay for it? I'll let somebody else pay for it, and then I don't have to. Sounds nice in theory. It comes with the implication that there's no way to monetize public goods like this. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of how they do work. Toll roads, number one, which nobody likes, but it's a thing. One suggestion that gets floated around libertarian circles a lot is allowing advertising on them. There's already billboards all over the place. You're already being bombarded with advertising while you're driving. Just, if I own my road, I can advertise on it. And I can sell advertising on it. So that's one way to monetize it. A couple of other examples. Domino's Pizza is running its own ad campaign right now. Domino's Pizza is driving around and fixing your roads. You may not know this. They call it paving for pizza, potholes for pizza, paving potholes for pizza. I think it's paving for pizza. If you go and look them up on this, they have a little video of a camera inside of a pizza box as they go over potholes and what happens to your poor pizza when it's driving over poorly maintained government roads. So yeah, Domino's is driving around fixing roads for you, which of course you're paying for, but you're paying for it willingly because you're buying a pizza, and you've decided that the price Domino's is charging is a price you're willing to pay for the pizza, and some of that money they are electing to go and randomly fix roads. Every time there's any kind of pretty critical government breakdown, there's always a million pictures of anarchists going out in the streets and just patching roads because they can, because they're tired of driving on them. If you live in a housing development, your homeowners association probably maintains the roads around your house. So you're paying for those through your homeowners association. You see the point I'm getting at here is that there's a million other ways to fund that project. But it's not just about funding, it's also about managing. Well, who could coordinate such a massive project across the entire nation? Good question. We're going to talk about that, and I'm going to explain to you exactly why the government is the only institution that could have built this massive, massive highway system we have stretching across the entire United States, and why they shouldn't have done it in the first place. So we go back to 1919, I believe was the year, 1919. A young Dwight D. Eisenhower, future general, future president, was an Army officer and got to partake in the 1919 Army Convoy, which was an effort to move military equipment from the East Coast to the West Coast. And it took them 56 days. It took them 56 days. They destroyed multiple wooden bridges. There were some injuries associated. It was just a whole fiasco because we didn't have a massive highway system like we do today. And Eisenhower, of course, would go on in his military career to fight in World War II and become president. And his number one concern was that in the Cold War, where we're having these conflicts with the Soviet Union, we needed that infrastructure. We needed to be able to quickly move equipment across the nation, and every military base needed to be hooked up to a highway system. The goal was defense. So we did. We built it. And I got to tell you, I love road trips. I personally have quite enjoyed the Eisenhower highway system. I love that. Personally, my favorite place in the world is Maine, and I love that if I'm willing to just, keep pounding coffee, I can make it from Greensboro, North Carolina to Maine in 16 hours. But here's the bitch about it. While this was a very good thing for a while, and it allowed us, I'm sure it helped spur along the industrialization of the United States. We've been able to move freight to and fro. Its original military purpose quickly became irrelevant. We will move freight between nearby bases via roads, but we don't do it over any long distances. We'll use rail, we'll use aircraft, we'll use ships. Honestly, World War II itself basically made the thing kind of redundant because at that point we no longer had bases in the United States. We had bases all over the world. You can't drive your trucks to Germany. You can't drive your trucks to Japan. And while it was a good thing for a while, we're now married to it. If you look at old cities in the United States, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, they're very compact. They're very cramped. They're tough to drive. If you look at cities that really didn't bloom until after the Industrial Revolution, and cities that really didn't have that huge population boom until like the baby boomers, and when, after the invention of the Ford Model T, those cities are huge and sprawling. They go for miles, like Dallas. And this is how our cities have to be. Thanks to the Eisenhower highway system and some very sleazy legislation, thanks to some automotive industry corporate lobbyists, you are married to your car. You can't get rid of it. You have to have a car. If you try to make it via public transportation in the United States, you're going to be late for work. You're going to have all of these kinds of problems related to that. We can't go back into our cities and build modern rail systems like we'd like to because they'll get in the way of the cars. Every business has to have a parking lot. Every house has to have a driveway. We have to have these sprawling miles of roads. We can't be like Moscow or Tokyo with these fantastic rail systems. You're stuck in your car. And that's becoming a bigger issue now as we become aware of climate change and people want to reduce their carbon footprint. Sounds nice. You have to have a car. You have to have a car in the United States. We are trying to get around that as badly as we want. But you're married to it. And that's because of the government. And that's just the roadway example. I'm going to go into a few other examples of why infrastructure is fucking you. One of them, energy. Depending on where you are in the United States, you don't have a choice in your power company. Your power company is sanctioned by the state to have a monopoly over your area. Now, their prices are controlled. They don't get to price you the way a monopoly might have the freedom to price you. But the government has decided that they want to protect you from the evils of competition in the energy industry. Which sounds nice. I mean, there's some problems that can be associated with competition in that, power lines running all over the place as different companies are going to different houses on the same street. But I am 27 years old, and as long as I've been able to turn on the news, I have been hearing the words global warming. And a few years after I was hearing global warming, I started hearing climate change. And I am a person who is aware of my environment, and I want to do right by the environment. It's not complicated. Given the choice between my current power company, which is getting, on average, 60 to 70% of the power it produces from fossil fuels, or a green alternative that costs a little more, if you gave me the choice, I would quite simply choose the green one. Problem solved. There's your libertarian answer to the environment. Do you want to go green? Yes, cool. Let you go green. That's it. Now what's stopping us? Well, the states monopolized your energy, and the government married you to your car like 80 years ago. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Both of those decisions did. Now you are paying for the sins and mistakes of your ancestors. They meant well. They weren't trying to screw you. Every possible issue they could foresee could be solved with these kinds of decisions, but as enough time passes, you're still paying for it. What's more, they always assumed we would have the money to fund these kinds of things. Oh, we're going to go forth with this huge infrastructure project. We've allotted the funds over the next 10 years. It's going to cost this much over the next 10 years. So we're going to go ahead and write a bill that sets that money aside. Well, 10 years later, there's new politicians, and those new politicians have their own agendas, and they don't really give a shit about your infrastructure. It's been financed and maintained for the last 10 years. We can skim a little bit out of that fund for the thing that I want to do over here, and I promised it while I was on the campaign trail, so I need to do it. A couple of years of neglect is not going to hurt the infrastructure too badly. And then we never really refinance it properly, and as inflation goes by, that gets worse and worse, which brings me to my
Hey, Paul, are you there? Did we lose that? Okay,
Hello?
so we lost. Is that you, Joe?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, we lost you for a second.
Oh, what was the last thing you heard me say?
You were talking about how you would choose green energy, and you went on from there, and then all of a sudden in mid-sentence we lost you. Man, that was the craziest thing. But look, before you go back, I've got a couple of things to add to that.
Hit me.
Yeah. So one is I wanted to comment on what you were before you moved on to the infrastructure and the local and how the government had monopolized energy, which they have. That was great. I wanted to talk about one of the things about why we are packed so much in cities. The other thing that the government has done, and this tells you just how multi-layered it is and how much they have trapped us in this, is that with all the government spending that goes on, where do you think the money's spent? Do you think it's really evenly distributed out throughout the United States? No. It's spent in the cities. And so you know what happens then is that since the wealth is concentrated into the cities because the government spends it, even though it taxes from all over the areas, whether it be local, state, or federal, especially on the state and federal, then that means it has to attract people to the cities. And that's where we get into the problems of overpopulation and overcrowding, and then we have to have roads that go 6 ways from Sundays that look like it's a total internet superhighway, and you get into those issues with that. So I just wanted to add that extra that, it's not just with them concentrating on infrastructure, it's with the whole damn thing of what they're doing with all their endless and reckless spending.
Exactly. I hope I'm not repeating myself too much. I'm trying to figure out where I got cut off.
You're fine.
Okay, I was talking about how we pledge ourselves to these big infrastructure projects, and these things don't go away. Once we promise them, we have to maintain them forever. We're stuck with them. And it sounds great. When we write the bill, we pledge ourselves to them for 10 years. We're going to finance this for the next 10 years. And then obviously, 10 years down the road, world's going to be a little bit different. They're going to do their own budgeting, but they have to make room for infrastructure. They have to provide funding for infrastructure, so they will. 10 years down the road, these new politicians, often not that new, doesn't even matter if they're new, they're campaigning.
Hey,
they're
guys,
trying to get
we
elected
have
again.
a caller. We've actually got a guy
All right.
from Singapore named Mike. I'm going to bring him on the line if you guys are ready.
Singapore. All right.
Sure, bring him on.
All right.
Mike,
awesome.
you're on Anti-Federalist Radio. Oh, is he not on yet?
Mike, thanks for holding. You are on the air live with Joe and Joe.
Mike, you're on Anti-Federalist Radio. Shoot.
Yes. Can you hear me, Joe and Bill? Can you hear me clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Pretty good.
Yeah. I appreciate taking my call. First of all, when a president doesn't put a mask and, goes to, for example, in Tulsa rally and with empty seats anyway. And and those people look at him as an example. They say, well, if he doesn't, we are not going to put it. They think that, is bad for you if you put a mask. No, the scientists say, if I put a mask and if we all three put a mask together, the chances of transmission to coronavirus is 5%. But if I choose not to do it, and both of you doing it, the chances are 95% to get the coronavirus. So, and he is, of course, selfish, arrogant, and of course, their cabinet members always, they have tested every day. For them, they have the luxury. But for the ordinary citizens, in the United States, they don't. So therefore, he needs to comply and put a mask. And, we see that today in Pence was saying something, and Dr. Anthony Fauci said something else, contradict itself. So this, one of the worst presidents in USA, how many people were fired from his administration or left? For example, Nikki Haley, she's so good, and she left there. She said, I cannot take this crap. She was the head of the UN, United Nations. And we saw also other ones, other spokespersons. His government is already in shakedown. How he can solve today's problem? He doesn't have even any solutions for today's problem. And then he wants to say, and then he goes there, he talks 20 minutes ranting about, I was coming down, I was going to, it's like a ramp. And then they showed the ramp. Joe Biden went the same ramp 2, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years ago. No problem. So, I don't understand. He thinks that he is the only one. He is the chosen one. He always say, I'm a chosen one. So is he saying that he is the return of Jesus Christ? That's absolutely wrong.
thank you for your.
Go ahead.
He probably thinks that he does. That he thinks that he's the return, and what you just touched on, Mike, is something that is very ominous about what we mean here at Anti-Federalist Radio. A lot of bureaucrats and politicians think that they walk on water, that they're more important than everybody else, that they've got the answers to our problems and all the 9 yards. And then when they have the answers to our problems, they come up with solutions, and the solutions just make the matters worse. And then we go into the whole cycle every single time. But we thank you for your call on that. We appreciate it. You are more than welcome to stay on and listen to us, but we appreciate your input on that and talking about all of those things. So going back to the infrastructure issue, you know, Joe was talking about the problems that was coming about with not only government controlling with the spending of infrastructure, but then he was talking about all the issues that were coming with the energy and how they're controlling the energy on the infrastructure. So, Joe, keep going on about that. That was good stuff.
Right. Well, I kind of made the point about the energy and how we get committed to these projects, and politicians, as they campaign on in the future, have to make more promises. They have to finance those promises. 10 years ends on the bill or whatever the timeline was, and they say, well, infrastructure has been kept up to this point. I can skim a little out of this fund to go into my project over here, and for a couple of years, infrastructure will be okay. It never really gets properly funded again, which is where we start running into problems. And I'm going to tell you about some of those problems. So we're going to start out with dams. What was the date? Bingo, May 19th and 20th. Some people might have heard about this. In Michigan, under the stress of heavy rain, 2 dams broke. 2 dams broke. 10,000 people were evacuated. 10,000. The estimated property damage from this is about $175 million. And 90% of the people whose homes have now been destroyed did not, according to the government, live in a flood risk area. Thus, most of them did not have flooding insurance. Now, according to, 2017 Infrastructure Report Card.org, 18% of our dams, wrong statistic. Where is it? 17% of our dams have been identified as high hazard potential. 17%, and we have 90,580 dams. So 17% of 90,000 dams are on the verge of breaking. We've never properly financed these, not in decades. We talk about infrastructure bills, but often that funding goes sideways. Even if we pass an infrastructure bill, we're already talking about siphoning money away from the DOD and Social Security for other kinds of projects. My question to the skeptical listener: can the private sector do worse than displacing 10,000 people and $175 million in property damage? And these are not isolated incidents.
Well, I've got one for you, Joe.
Hit me.
Flint, Michigan. Look at the disaster that happened with the water quality in Flint, Michigan. You know, there you have another, monopoly controlled by the local governments, full complaining about the water quality, which was horrible. I mean, if you ever saw the clips of that back in 2014, 2015, they were god-awful. And, you know, the local governments did nothing. The state governments did nothing. And that's the problems that you have when you have a monopoly. You don't have options. I mean, my God, if we had sat there and allowed competition to thrive in our water system, where if we didn't like the quality of one water company, we can go to another one, that would make a whole lot more sense. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Not just competition, because that's referring specifically to the infrastructure of city water.
Yeah,
you have to have a permit to collect rainwater, and within city limits, you usually cannot dig a well. You have to get permission from the government to dig a well on your own property.
Good point.
Because while you own the property, they own what's underneath the property, and you can't collect rainwater. It's illegal to collect rainwater without a permit. But the alternative is what's happening in Flint, Michigan. We live in Greensboro, North Carolina. One of the lakes and reservoirs that currently feeds water to Greensboro is the Randleman Lake. My dad's from Randleman. I grew up about half in Greensboro, half in Randleman, and that was still a river when I was growing up. I was actually in high school when they finally plowed down the trees, built the dam, and filled all that. We'd always known it was going to happen. We'd known for decades. But I remember walking that river and seeing the pollution in it, and we were just told, don't worry, we'll be able to purify it. It's going to be safe for drinking water. And now Greensboro advises that you should have a filter on your tap. We paid for it. We were guaranteed clean water, and now it's on you to go and spend your money anyway to filter it in your home, and that filter is not even going to stop most of it. The infrastructure is failing you. To keep going on this, I talked about the dams. Bridges, 9.1% of the nation's bridges were structurally deficient in 2016. You don't have to Google for long to find news articles about bridges collapsing in the United States and people dying sometimes, and the engineer who was responsible for checking it says, well, I did, and I said it was going to collapse. On to levees. We knew that in the case of Katrina, that levee wasn't going to hold up to a Cat 5 hurricane. We never got around to it, and we all know how FEMA did with that. 17%. Oh, no, that's dams. Where are we at? Where's my statistic for this?
And one extra point about the levees. Can I jump in right quick? The one extra point about the levees, let's not forget what the government involves itself in the insurance industry to subsidize things that are flood insurance and flood-prone areas, which then gives people to move into those dangerous areas because it's artificially cheaper, and then that just sets them up for disaster, which then FEMA has to come in and clean up.
Exactly. There are an estimated 30,000 to 100,000 miles of levees across the country. $1.3 trillion in property value is behind levees. Most of these were built and maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Levee Safety Program. They protect over 300 colleges and universities, 30 professional sports venues, 100 breweries, and an estimated $1.3 trillion in property. The thing with these is that without government, these dams wouldn't have been built, these levees wouldn't have been built, and these places just wouldn't be livable. You wouldn't have these lakes and these communities built downstream of a lake. That just wouldn't be a thing. We build the dam and we assume it's always going to be safe and secure and funded and maintained, so these places are safe to live. Now the question arises, well, what the hell do you do with a dam? How do you just undo a dam? That's a problem, because these communities have been built up. The downstream area no longer looks like it did when it was a river. You can't just let go. And this is a pretty critical problem, but the beautiful thing about it is that I don't necessarily have to have the solution. Now, the first one that comes to mind for me is you've already got the dam. Look at hydroelectric. Instead of maintaining the dam, sell the thing. You can sell this dam at a profit. The state or the locality can actually get rid of this thing and net money for it. And a private company can take it over and turn it into a hydroelectric facility. Now, when you talk about green energy, hydroelectric is usually not a part of the conversation. And the reason for that is that even though the product is very clean, the massive amount of environmental destruction associated with building a dam and flooding an area, most environmentalists say that it's really, there's better options, but the dam is already there. And all it is right now is a stone wall waiting to break and destroy a community. Sell it to a company, let them provide hydroelectric power in competition with whatever state monopoly is in the area, and now they have a vested interest in maintaining the dam and keeping it secure, because suing a corporation is not the same thing as suing the government. When you sue the government, you sue yourself. You take your winnings in that lawsuit out of the budget, and then in future years they have to expand the budget to pay off the lawsuit, and you're just taxing yourself for it or paying out of pocket in the form of inflation. It's not the same with a corporation. A dam breaking that a corporation owns is the end of that corporation. They are fucked. They're not going to let that happen. They can't. Levees, the levees are a little bit weirder. It's a lot harder to privatize a levee, but at the same time, why the fuck are we building them? You know, if you want to live in an extremely critically dangerous place when it comes to flooding, you can pay the flood insurance. That's your problem. I'm not doing it. I'm going to live uphill. roads were the last tab that I had pulled up on that page. And I'm sure there's an interesting 2 out of 5 miles of urban interstates are congested. 6.9 Americans spend 6.9 billion hours in traffic. Yeah, you get the point. Who's going to build the roads? My question to you is, honest to God, can the private sector do worse than the government's doing? And can the private sector deny you the things you actually want right now, like efficient transportation and clean energy and a house that's not going to get fucking annihilated? I don't really think we can. I don't think we can do worse than that. Joe, you got anything to add to that?
Not on that part. I gave you my commentary on that. I do want to give a couple of comments on this in the general. At Anti-Federalist Radio, we bring up a lot of these points, and, some of them are very technical like this. Now, Joe, covered a huge, widespread topic on this about the damages of government. If you guys would like to see a change in how, government operates, you cannot vote for the two-party system. So in North Carolina, which is where our home base is, we've got a candidate who is running for governor. His name is Stephen DeFeary. If you're in North Carolina and if you're listening to this, give him the vote. Stephen would be a whole lot more receptive to addressing these types of issues. And, that's the thing is that we are going to have an upswelling of independent-minded, liberty-minded candidates with outside-the-box thinking running at the local, municipal, and state levels to initiate these kinds of changes. We libertarians rightfully recognize the damage that goes on with our government spending and, the way that they control our markets. But a lot of times, many people just don't realize how much the government has actually taken from us. And that's what we're doing here. What Joe just laid out to you here, what I've laid out to you on the aggregate scale, we are telling you and trying to open your eyes just how much the government has taken from you. So that way you can recognize that it's time to take it back.
Yeah. Hey, you said Stephen DeFore. That's who you mentioned, right? Did you mention Stephen? Stephen DeFore, tomorrow, 12:30 p.m., Barbecue Factory in Winston-Salem. The address is 701 North Liberty Street, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The Libertarian Party of Forsyth County is hosting it. He's coming out. If you're listening, if you're in the area, come see the guy. We really should have shouted that out last week. Also, Ed the Anti-Fed, I know you're listening. Good to have a loyal follower. Glad you're hanging on, bud.
And I think that will do it for tonight's episode. You got anything else, Joe?
We talked about the blood drives coming up. We talked about Steve tomorrow. Finally did infrastructure. I'm good.
All right. So, guys, thank you for tuning in with us. As the weeks come on, we're going to give you more updates about the campaign trail, what's going on in the political world, and how we libertarians can affect that. And as of course, I'm Joe, your economic host. I'll be giving you the updates and the play-by-play action and just how much the government's screwing you over in the economy.
Depending on what happens in the world, if all's quiet, I may talk about labor relations and unionization and libertarian ideas on this, and libertarian ideas and my own ideas. We'll see what happens.
Which will always go ahead, man.
That's it.
Yeah, which will definitely play a role because, as you know, the unions play huge parts in backing the Democrat and the Socialist. So we'll definitely be hammering those issues point by point in the coming weeks. So once again, this is Anti-Federalist Radio. We thank you for listening to us. If you want to be part of the conversation, you can join us by calling in at the number 516-418-5584. Make sure that you like and follow us on Facebook. We are in the process of creating our own Twitter page. We will probably be going out and sending out tweets about the events that are going on, as well as certain news articles that are interesting. Make sure that you follow us and comment on that. You can comment on our Facebook pages. Other ways to contact us, you can email us at antifederalistradio@gmail.com. We're also found not only on Blog Talk Radio, which is our home base for our podcast, but you can find us on Stitcher. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Google Podcasts. You can find us on YouTube, and just help spread the voice. So we thank you for listening, and this is Anti-Federalist Radio signing out.